to have you all here, and particularly the opportunity to listen to Dr. Ashli Sheidow, who is a senior research scientist and also the science director at the Oral and Social Learning Center. Her work has been funded primarily by the NIMH and NIDA and has included research on treatments and services for adolescents and emerging adults who have substance use problems and our legal system involved. And that's really one of the exciting parts of her work is, as we all know, who work with children in the legal system, that's a particularly challenging group. She also studies effective implementation of evidence-based practices by improving training, support, and task shifting and in low-resource environments, as well as recovery support services and community-engaged research with and by people with lived experience in recovery and the legal system. She has spearheaded intervention, development, and evaluation projects, as well as dissemination and implementation research. And I'm particularly excited that today she's going to present on task shifting, which, by the way, was a term I didn't know, but I looked it up, and we will all learn about it. A task shifting study with juvenile probation officers delivering contingency management treatment to youth and their parents, caregivers. Ashli, thank you so much for being here, and the floor is all yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for having me, and it's really a true honor to share this space with you. And I get excited about finding connections of people with overlapping passions. So Jose hit on some of the high spots of where my interests and my passions are. But I hope that if you hear something where you have an overlapping interest, that you'll bring up stuff during the discussion period or reach out to me directly, because I'd love to connect. Jose gave that bird's eye view of sort of the range of my interest, and the sort of the common denominator is this my research is sort of I'm a treatment and a services researcher, but it's all focused around a population really, and so youth and emerging adults who have legal system involvement, substance use disorders, mental health disorders, or other systems involvement, like aging out of child welfare or the like, and particularly combinations of those. We all know those combinations, that overlap is all too common, and it's sort of why I approach this. I take a socio-ecological approach to conceptualization, so I fall in that camp, and that's sort of the big picture overview. I also have this passion around the delivery of and access to evidence-based practices, or EBPs, for that population. And then I also have this passion around mentoring and helping people who are underrepresented in NIH funding come into the field and be at all levels of the research enterprise, but in particular, people whose elevating the voice of people with lived experience in all aspects of the research enterprise, but hopefully in more and more conducting and leading the research. So again, rundowns of my passions, but I would love to connect if there are folks that share those interests. So I'm going to talk today about a specific study that I called the JPOCM study. And I want to pause, of course, to thank NIDA for their financial support, and also to the partners that I've had on these efforts. I couldn't have done it without them. And also some disclaimers. I co-own Arena, which is a small business that's focused on contingency management. And I will be talking about CM today. I'm also a co-owner of Science to Practice Group, which is focused on multisystemic therapy for emerging adults, or MISTE, which I won't be talking about today, but I just wanted to be transparent. And if folks have questions, I'm very informal. So if you want to put them in the chat, put them in the chat. I'll try to pay attention. But if it really is pertinent and it would be better for us to pause and have your questions, then just speak up and talk over me. So this is I like this figure, I call it a training triangle. I like this figure just because it shows very simply the stages from basic training to learning it well enough to deliver it correctly. And then assessment corresponding to each of those stages also have this little bit of interest around good quality assessment. So I like this because it does have that assessment piece off to the side. And the assumption here is that, and I'm sure there are folks on this call that are working on this issue. The assumption is that training leads to increased competency and that will lead to therapists or providers being able to do the intervention correctly in the real world. With various variables coming into play here. But the requisite knowledge and know-how is the starting foundational element. And that's the area that I'm most interested in when it comes to sort of this process. You all know that most trainings provide some amount of knowledge, of course, at top of the triangle, but they don't often provide the practice to achieve the know-how. Much less getting them to the full competency where they could be able to show how in at least an artificial setting, like a mock session. And almost never does training continue to the implementing in the real world part. So I have this long running interest in how to get people to do it correctly and to move through that training triangle. But the downfall most frequently is that, you know, while typical trainings are efficient and feasible, and it makes sense why we need training to be efficient and feasible to be able to be disseminated out into the world and sent out into the world. But most of those trainings end up not being effective when we're talking about evidence-based practices. And so I like this visual. This is an example of a study, and I really, this is not my study. I love this study, though. It's an old Miller study about motivational interviewing training. And I love it because it so cleanly illustrates visually what happens. I like it. I also like it because the vast majority of juvenile probation officers, or JPOs, I'll talk about them today in a study. The vast majority of JPOs have had in our country have had training in MI. Right. So, but I can say from having watched their actual work that very little MI is going on in their sessions. And I've watched a lot of their sessions. So this study, a couple of things that I love about it is it had a really high quality experiential workshop. So this was a 2-day solid workshop with role plays, experiential learning, great stuff. So the follow-up was just 4 months after the 2-day workshop, and the effects were already lost. 4 months. So some of you may know, if you know MI coding, that minimal competency level is to get to at least a 1, but preferably you want people at a 1.5 to 2. 1.5 is not even on this graph. It's not even on the graph, right? So to get to that competency, they weren't even able to do that. There were some immediate post-training bumps, but those were only for the more straightforward skills in MI. If you look over to the right, those are the more complex skills for MI, and 4 months. So those there wasn't really much of a bump on. And then by 4 months, those black bars, they were already back to barely above baseline. And so you can see the author's conclusion over there in the box. A somewhat hidden finding in this study, I told you I love this study for a lot of reasons. A somewhat hidden finding is that after the workshop, there were 6 optional discussion sections that were provided with expert trainers. And those were offered bi-weekly to all the trainees, but there was very minimal participation in those. The average was less than 1. And that's the same in all of my studies where we've offered optional follow-up. So that ongoing training component that we know can be important, even when it's offered, if it's not a more assertive follow-up process, then it's not even utilized. And that's what I've changed over time to where I do use a more assertive follow-up process in things where there's training. And this is just one study to show one study of many to show these kinds of patterns. It's also critical, I think, to keep in mind 2 things that but others have found when trying to study trainee performance. And the first one is that trainees report that their performance is of higher competency than what actual behavior shows. So that then leads us into some, problems around assessment, or some dilemmas, some things to think about when it comes to assessment. And then secondly, even clinicians who are intensively trained to a very high fidelity. So they're clinicians who are part of a research trial and trained to a high level of fidelity, even they drift after the trial is over. And so that's even when they think the protocols work for their clients. So even when you have super fans, when you have clinicians that are super fans, even them without ongoing training and support, drift is just inevitable. And so I think those are really two key points to think about. And that leads into what I know we're not supposed to pick our favorites. I got two kids. I know we're not supposed to pick favorites, but I just can't help it. This study is my favorite study. It's a research project that was about JPOs incorporating contingency management, or CM, into their everyday practices with youth who have substance use disorders. We call it the JPO CM study. And it was a study, as Jose mentioned, of task shifting. And so task shifting is taking something clinical and bringing it downstream from clinically trained staff to providers who are already indigenous in the community, in a given community. And so here, what we're talking about is taking a family-based contingency management protocol that's usually delivered by therapists, but therapists usually aren't available in rural and frontier communities. And so we tried out task shifting it to JPOs instead. And JPOs serve every single county in our country, right? So they are an indigenous workforce. And we looked at, could we task shift them to JPOs instead of therapists? And a note for those of you who may be familiar with juvenile justice systems, a lot of, and including myself, we're familiar with juvenile justice systems that are mostly in urban or city JJ systems. So you might have experience with JPOs that are master's level trained. But this is not so in rural areas. Many aren't even bachelor's level in rural areas. So it's a very different kind of context. Some also serve as both the adult probation officer in the county and the juvenile justice officer in the county. So probation services can be very different when we look at these low resource communities, and that's important to keep in mind, especially if your experience has been in large systems. So the purpose of this study was to focus on the JPOs and their experiences with an emphasis on rural areas. The questions we had were whether or not JPOs could even learn to conduct a family-based contingency management protocol, how their performance compared to that of therapists who were conducting the same thing, and then what the JPOs reported the experience was like for them, and along with their perceptions about youth who use substances and families of these youth. And I cannot thank the partners and participants enough that we have learned so much from them. You'll see some things that were very surprising to us, and we've learned so much. They've been amazing, and they've also been really fun partners to have. And it's various counties, and this one was in Idaho, across Idaho, Nevada, and Oregon counties. And I also want to mention another partner that she didn't know she was a partner at the time, but this idea actually came, for this sort of task shifting idea, came from a leader of juvenile justice in Connecticut, who back in 2003. So it was a long time coming, but that's even where the idea came from, was from the juvenile justice system, hearing about therapists doing contingency management. These are the currently published articles that we have. And by the way, I have some slides today, including this one, that have far too many words that are and some of it, I'm summarizing some qualitative data. There are quotes from qualitative work that I wanted to include in case folks were interested. I'm happy to send the slides out to folks afterwards. So I'm not going to read everything on the slides. Don't feel like you need to read all the things on the slides, but I just wanted it there for people that might be interested later. So these are the currently published things. We have 2 more that are under review and others in preparation. And I also want to note 2 things is that for this particular study, all the qualitative work was done by students of Faye Taxman, and the quantitative work was all done under the supervision of Jason Chapman. This slide has some brief background information, but about the study purpose of JPOCM, but the gist is that kids involved in the juvenile legal system are more likely to need substance use treatment. Many don't have good access to treatment, and certainly not access to evidence-based practices, and most assuredly not to family-based EBPs. But at the same time, JPOs work in every jurisdiction in the US, and based on my and my team's experiences, as well as some prior research, we thought that family-based CM was something that we might be able to task shift to JPOs to deliver to families. And as I said, I was especially interested in exploring the options for rural communities. I've got a few slides here that are about the CM protocol, but I'm going to skip through those to get to what the JPOs actually taught us. But we can definitely circle back to these if there's interest. So, and I will pause here for a quick overview because there's a key point I want you to keep in mind. So the CM protocol that we use, it includes engaging the family, developing an individualized reward system, the parents implementing drug testing alongside the provider implementing drug testing, and then identifying triggers and using that to develop self-management plans and savvy drug refusal skills. And the main point to remember is that the CM has both behavior modification components, many of which the JPOs may already be doing, right? So we had to sort of measure what they were, we had to have a control group knowing what JPOs normally deliver when it comes to levels of behavior modification, and then also cognitive behavioral components as well. We had 2 types of participants in this study. The JPOs were randomized to either to continue doing their probation services as usual, or to learn and try to do CM. And then we also had youth and their caregivers, and they were randomized to either be assigned to a probation as usual JPO or a PAU JPO, or to a CM JPO. We did baseline focus groups with all the JPOs, subgroupings of all the JPOs together. We didn't pre-randomize them. And then after they were randomized, we did additional follow-up focus groups with the CM JPOs and then separately with the PAU JPOs. And then we also had some qualitative data from them as well. This slide tells, again, it tells about the training and support that the JPOs received. Not going to go into detail here, but again, happy to circle back if that's of interest to folks. So this slide is the left column here describes the sample of JPOs who were in the study. And importantly, this was a higher rate of minority individuals and a larger range of education than any other study of JPOs that I've come across. That makes sense though, because studies tend to have, studies tend to have samples that are mostly white individuals and bachelor's degree or higher. And it makes sense because studies need to have large sample sizes. And so they tend to be cited in metropolitan areas instead of sort of spread across a bunch of counties like we did. We had 14 counties across 3 different states. So that sort of doesn't tend to work very well for resources within a study. So as shown here, some of the things are the bottom left there. It's the norm to have some training in what we typically think of as intervention. But most often the focus of these is targeting recidivism behavior and not substance use behavior. So JPOs get some training in like how to go after the recidivism behavior, but the substance use behavior is sort of like, I'm not really sure what to do about that. Even though in reality, the same behavior modification techniques could be used, but that's not how they're trained. They're trained on it related to recidivism behavior. The baseline focus groups also gave us insight into how the JPOs thought about EBPs. So over on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the interesting findings there. Most of them actually felt that their agency encouraged new techniques and trying things. But they listed over 40 different practices and programs as being under the category of EBP. So when we asked them, what are the EBPs you've learned about? They listed over 40 different programs, but in reality, many listed had no or little evidence. So if you go into like crime solutions, where that's their main go-to for the legal system, most of them had little or no evidence. And so it seems like a name brand sort of gets called an EBP in the probation officers' minds. They also said that EBP is a buzzword, and they said that new EBPs are constantly introduced. They described it as a flavor of the month cycle. And they said, importantly, that they aren't trained how to integrate these new flavors into their practices. And then before they can even figure out how on their own how to try to integrate that, they're on to the next flavor of the month that they're being trained in. And so there's that sort of cycle that they talked about. They talked about without having support as well as set aside time, that they really struggle to integrate an EBP into their practice. And I have a quote here. You really have to be proactive and ask. And if you ask enough, maybe you can go to a training, meaning an additional training follow-up. And then there were also generalizability concerns. And again, I've got a quote here. The best evidence-based, best practice programs usually are programs that come out of the prison system that are designed for adults and that are being modified for juveniles to be sold to a juvenile probation department. They also said that EBPs are not adaptable to their geographic area. And so remember, in reality, not a lot of large studies are in these rural areas. They're usually in large cities due to sample size needs. But so they have a really valid point here. Even when if they were to read the literature, they're not going to come across counties like theirs or JPOs like them. So overall, we concluded that there's a sort of these factors lead to an EBP fatigue amongst JPOs. We also were able to examine the JPO's perceptions of about sanctions and incentives. And you can imagine this directly applies to implementing CM correctly, because we need them to rethink what they're doing with sanctions, and we need them to really lean heavily on incentives when we're and also convey that message to parents. So we're trying to change that thinking. And previous studies had not examined how JPOs actually perceive the effectiveness of sanctions, right? So they measured, do they use sanctions or not, but they haven't measured how the JPOs are perceiving the effectiveness of those sanctions. Previous studies also hadn't looked at how JPOs view incentives or whether any of those differences about how they perceive those things relate to JPO characteristics. And so I'm not going to go through all these bullets, but overall at baseline, JPOs were really split on views about sanctions and incentives. So there was a real split, some in favor, some not so much. But even those who didn't see, who were sort of pro-sanctions, saw the value of sanctions, even those didn't think that sanctions were a long-term solution for substance use. So maybe they liked it for short-term targeting substance use, but they didn't see sanctions as being a long-term solution for substance use. And there was some suggestion in our data about the characteristics of JPOs that could predict who might have CM uptake more readily. So this all leads us, so that was sort of more of the baseline, some of the baseline stuff, but this all led into this really big question of the study about the capacity of JPOs to deliver CM. Can JPOs deliver CM to youth and families? And CM adherence is what we used. We were assessing the delivery of the CM components. That's what our CM adherence was. It's a way we use to measure the uptake of each JPO. And what we found is that CM adherence was higher among CM JPOs compared to PAU JPOs. And that was both for the behavior modification components as well as the cognitive behavioral components. And for this, we had observational coding of actual youth and family sessions. So the JPO meeting with youth and families, and we coded those. And the CM JPOs delivered 4 times more cognitive behavioral components of CM versus the PAU JPOs. And you can see that middle thing over there on the right, they delivered 15 times more behavior modification components. And keep in mind, those behavior modification components or tasks are already a part, some of them are already a part of routine JPO work. Our study question 2 was about how does the JPO CM adherence compare to that of therapists. The CM JPOs actually delivered significantly more cognitive behavioral components and a greater, although not statistically significant, level of behavior modification components compared to therapists. I'm gonna say that again. JPOs did better than CM master's level trained, supervised in a clinical trial therapist. And that really shocked us. So now let me say, it shocked us when because we heard about it. We saw it, we were watching it in action. So when we got to the point of the findings, we weren't shocked. We were pleased because it confirmed what we had been witnessing during the course of the study. But this was, prior to this study, this was not at all what we were expecting to see. And then finally, it's not shown here, but finally, we recently confirmed and have a paper under review that this initial difference between groups is sustained for the into the whole first year of implementation. So there was like this 4-month window, and then we looked a year out after that, and the differences were sustained. So for a different study question, we were looking into what was the JPO's perceptions about youth and families. What did they think? This is youth who use substances and their families. What do they think about that? What is their perception? And we found an interesting thing happen because remember, we did some focus group over time, and we had some data points over time. And so we had a group that was we had a group doing their usual services, and then we had a group of JPOs that were learning to do CM and being asked to do CM with families. We found an interesting thing happen, that learning and doing CM actually changed the JPO's views about youth and families. It made them think more positively about these youth and families. Again, an unexpected finding to us. I won't go through all the bullets here, but there's a quote here that CM reinforced a way for me to draw parents more into the process with their kids. And I think CM gives the parents more of a buy-in, basically. I think they feel more involved in what's going on with their kids. So some things for us that were surprising. Another study question was about what were the JPO's experiences like with CM? What was it like for those who were doing CM? What was that experience like? And we found we found some evidence of penetration as well, meaning they were using CM with non-study cases. They were using, some of them, remember I told you that some POs in these rural counties play dual roles where they're JPOs as well as adult probation officers. Some of them were even using it with their adult probation clients as well. So some evidence of penetration. And then there were some other positive impacts on the JPOs, mainly focused about how they thought about incentives and sanctions. So we found that it is indeed feasible for JPOs to incorporate the full CM model into their services, plus some surprising findings to inform our future work. And we really think that CM could generate a major impact because, again, JPOs work in every region of the US, and especially in these rural communities that lack substance use services. So that's where we really see that we might be able to make a difference. So I wanted to, I'm gonna stop sharing my slides here, and I can reshare if we need to go back. But I took a few notes because for this, I thought I might talk a little bit about things that from a researcher perspective, things that made JPO CM possible. And I'm also, then we can go into discussion. I'm happy to discuss any of these more, the study more, or any of those sort of the overarching passions that I have that might be of more interest. So happy to go in any direction that folks want. But I just thought this would be sort of more of, it's never going to make it in a paper. It's more of the experience as a researcher of what I viewed. So call it anecdotal if you want to, but I just figured I'd share my experiences with you on this. So I mentioned earlier that the spark of this idea came from that leader in the Connecticut juvenile justice system. And and just by her hearing and saying like, well, couldn't JPOs do this? That was it. It was one statement, and that was the spark of the idea. And then subsequently, we had juvenile justice leaders in, especially in Idaho, but also in Nevada and Oregon, and they saw the value and they helped push this through. It was a true partnership to make this happen. And the bottom line is that you know, champions are the key. As any implementation scientist will tell you, champions are the key. So that's one thing. Also, we recruited lots of counties. I told you there were 14 in total and lots of JPOs. But even still, I had to exclude counties because I had counties coming to me that only had one JPO, and I had two conditions. So at the very least, I had to have two JPOs in a county for them to participate in the study. And interestingly to me, those counties with just the one JPO, those were the counties that were most interested in the training and support that this study had, and in this idea of CM. And so a subsequent study that I helped design, we learned from that, and we are using a step wedge design so that we aren't limited, and we are including those counties with just the one JPO. So lessons learned, don't make my same mistake. Another point is just all the flexibility that my staff had to have to figure out just the massive changes throughout this study. So, changes in policies and administrative changes in how Oregon, we had Measure 110, the decriminalization, and we had sort of changes in how the legal system and the cops on the street were looking at substance use. And so just changes in some of those policies and procedures. And then, of course, there was COVID and the near weekly changes in protocols that we had smack in the middle of the study. And any of you who ran trials during COVID and you want to vent about this, I'm your person. I'm there with you. I am there for you. COVID just about sank this study, but the JPOs themselves and the staff we had, they stuck with us. They never faltered. They wanted to try to figure out how to make this work. And when our motivation would fail, they came through time and time again. Even still, though, recruiting and retaining participants in research was a huge hit. COVID was a huge hit to the rates. And this was even more so the case in studies that I had where we are recruiting, retaining emerging adults. At least in this study, we had parents that usually had a working phone number that we could track down and try to find. And they usually had a home of residence. With the studies with emerging adults, those during COVID, anyway, y'all know where I'm coming from, I'm sure. We also had staff who were willing to cover a huge geographical area. So we were out on the ground recruiting these kids and families and the JPOs. And I mentioned that some of the counties had to be excluded because they just had one JPO. Some counties that were interested had to be excluded because they were too far geographically. So these are massive states: Nevada, Idaho, Oregon. It takes like 8 hours to get from one end of Oregon to the other, right? So some of these counties were as big as Connecticut, to give you an idea of how big some of these just a single county. So we would have to use clusters of counties that were sort of regionally clustered together, but that excluded some counties that were very interested, but they were just too far out of the cluster. Some of them would try to rally other counties around them to be a site, and to get us to pick their part of the state. But we had to sort of focus in on that. But even still, the staff covered huge geographic areas. Related to that widespread geography issue, we had web-based training and support, a web-based training and support system for contingency management, and that had been built upon earlier NIDA-funded studies. So we were able to benefit from that for this study. Without that, we wouldn't have been able to go on site doing all of this. And during COVID, that would have been entirely shut down. So we really were, there were some really lucky elements there that we had to be able to take advantage of. I also want to just talk about these amazing JPOs, and I love them and their insight. I love their near universal passion for helping kids and parents. And then also the kids and the parents who took a chance on research and us, especially in communities that were very suspicious about research, and they took a chance on us. They let their JPO sessions be recorded and submitted to a research study. That, I mean, that you don't do that in normal day-to-day life, right? That's just so for them to take a chance on us with research just was really powerful to me. And on that note, I want to say that getting observed adherence is incredibly, incredibly hard. I know that that's what we need to get to that bottom level of measuring, that get further down into that training triangle measurement wise, but it is very hard to get that to happen. There's you have to recruit youth and families if you're going to do that versus mock sessions with a JPO. You have to have the secure technology, all of that jazz. It is also extremely time intensive to code so many tapes. That was our key outcome. So we coded hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tapes, and it's just very difficult to code that many. But even before you start coding, you got to get your coders up to such a high degree of reliability because that is your key outcome that you're measuring. So it's tough work, and it's logistically and time intensive. Like I'm trying to find another word for nightmare, so I'm not quite so doomsday, but it is just incredibly hard. And just, I guess it's more of buyer beware. If you're going to go down that road of having that be your key outcome, just buyer beware. Plan for it, think about the logistics, and plan for it. So those were just some of the lessons learned and ideas that sort of bounce around in my head when I think about this study and what it's been like being a researcher trying to do this type of study. And so with that, I'd love to have discussion, like I said, either about the study, my experiences with it, or anything amongst the other things I'm passionate about. I'm working with Tess Drozdowski on applying some of the work that we're doing with this JPOCM study to work with adult probation officers who work with emerging adults and their social network. I've got Misty stuff going on. I'm leading the Jeep initiative that's focused on recovery support services. So really happy to go in any direction that would be helpful.
Ashli, I want to ask about sustainment, and I'm not sure how far back the study ended, so I apologize for that. But did you get a sense from any of the counties that you worked with that they plan to sustain the use of contingency management?
Yeah, that's excellent. So it's one of a point of great sadness for me that the counties and we have some systems for being able to continue to provide training, because they have a lot of turnover, and how do they keep that going? So they weren't able to keep it as sort of like an organized system, but there are parts of things going on, and so like some counties. They created reward cabinets or closets. And so they are changing practices on what they're doing in the reward systems. Some of them did sustain within the context of their juvenile drug courts. So they took, we actually had to exclude JPOs that were working because we know juvenile drug courts are an effective intervention in and of themselves. And so if the JPO was the drug court JPO only, we excluded them, and we excluded the cases that were in drug court from the participating in the study. But some of the counties took what they were learning and they pulled it into their drug courts, juvenile drug courts. And then some of them have continued to try to sustain parts of it. So they're still using their handouts and their books that we gave them, the notebooks that we gave them with the CM materials. But I actually have John Toole, who leads the Robert F. Kennedy, it's a foundation focused on juvenile justice. We were actually on the phone just recently with the state judge, juvenile judge in Idaho, recently retired, because that's an area that they want to really put some effort into. Good question.
Thank you for an excellent presentation. I was wondering, you talked about the lack of sustainability of evidence-based intervention use. Did you maintain the training and supervision on an ongoing basis in order to handle that? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so this is, I mentioned that, and I just in full disclosure, so I'm co-owner of Arena that has this training and support system that's a web-based training and support system. So I just like to tell folks that. So we were able to use that entire system. And so there's this initial online training that's self-paced that folks can go through, but there are check-ins throughout that with a lead trainer. And then there is an ongoing training and support as part of that. And so there's availability to sort of a lead trainer and being able to access a lead trainer throughout. We also, then I mentioned we do assertive. It used to be just call us if you need us, but I've learned my lesson on that one. So we did assertive outreach and that was sort of, that was individualized. And so that was one-on-one work with the JPOs. Weekly, every other week, sort of usually tapered out to monthly, but it was based on the JPO's needs and what their preference was. And interestingly, they never said no. It was always optional. It was like, hey, would you like to set up another time to talk in a week or two? Yeah, let's do that. we never had anyone sort of push back on that. And then we also had once a month networking calls that were the JPOs, and it was smaller clusters. We usually try to keep those at around 10, and so it's sort of like a learning collaborative or community of learning, learning community once a month, and we would have it would be a chance for them to talk about any issues they were coming up with, or to problem solve anything, or to celebrate anything or things they've learned. And then we would also have topics. So things that we were hearing collectively from the different JPOs or seeing, we would have sort of booster. So it was a little bit of booster topic type of work. So 1 hour a week, 1 hour a month calls for the duration of the study, their time in the study.
Yeah, I have another question. Did you measure at all the outcomes in the youth?
Yeah, we do have that. And so we are waiting. We're doing, I want to say it's 18-month follow-up. So we're waiting. This summer, we'll get the last data on the youth, the legal system data from the youth this summer.
Hello, Ashli. This is Geeta Subramaniam. I'm sorry, I joined a little late, so I missed the early part. But thank you for really going into territories that other people fear going into. So I must congratulate you on your, really pioneering work, particularly, getting into a system where the legal services are involved, and probation officers, they carry the stigma of being notoriously difficult to work with. So you've proven us wrong. So that's really amazing. So I mean, I really am grateful for your work, and thank you for generating the evidence. So my follow-up question is, and you may have answered this, but I didn't get it. What do you think made it different as to why their rates, their scores were higher than your well-trained master's level folks? That's question number one. And I'll ask you my second question. And if you can train probation officers, then have you thought about training parents to do this so that they don't have to go to a entity to do this, where they can do it themselves?
Yeah, awesome questions, Geeta. So thank you for your comments. I really do adore this study and have been. I knew JPOs before, but this just made me. It turned the tide, and I really feel like we're in a different place in the legal system in our country for juveniles. So we're making headway. So I always get the question of why. Why are they doing better than therapists? Because our thought was just to benchmark them against like, can they do as well as therapists? That was the way we framed the question. So I didn't collect data as to why they would be better. I don't know. It's an empirical question of what makes it where they're better. My hypothesis on this is this is from observing the discussions, because we did have some in there who were master's level trained, and many of them, when they were master's level trained, they were masters in social work. And so my hypothesis on this, which is testable, is it seems as though therapists have a lot of tools in their toolbox. They get trained in a lot of different things, and they feel like they have a lot of tools in their toolbox. I will say sometimes they think they have tools in their toolbox, but it's a very rough tool and they're not really using it correctly. They're holding the hammer up at the neck instead of down at the bottom like they're supposed to, right? So whereas JPOs, when it comes to substance use, they ain't got no tools. Ain't nobody giving them tools, and they are scared to do it. They think a therapist is supposed to do it. They don't know what to do. Working with parents, they're told they need to. They know that that's the key to success, but they aren't given concrete skills. And how do you work with parents? And how do you work with parents and kids together to make headway? And so my hypothesis is that we gave them one tool, and we gave them excellent training in how to use that tool. We gave them ongoing guidance, like, oh, I've got two parents and they're divorced and they live in separate households, or I've got a grandma that just took over custody of this, all these different parenting arrangements. And we were there for them to help problem solve what to do about those different arrangements. And so they're given this one tool and they use it. That's my hypothesis. Whereas therapists, they've got all these tools, and they see, oh, well, this kid's got some trauma, so maybe I should use my trauma focused type of procedures, that the TFCBT or whatnot. And they go down these paths of, like, instead of just like, let's just focus in and just do the CM. And it's the kids in the justice system, they still have those same degree of trauma rates, but they just stay focused, like, oh, I know how to use this tool, and we're going to get this substance use under control. And then the family relationship starts getting better, and the kids can actually go to the therapy that they, it comes at it from like a different angle. So that's my hypothesis. It's testable, something I'm still interested in, but I always get that question of why. So did that answer? That was your first question, right, Geeta?
That's right.
Okay. And second question of training parents. And so it's interesting because we have to clarify this whenever we write papers. The task shifting was task shifting to JPOs, not task shifting to parents. But you can see from the protocol that we use for CM, we actually do train the parents in a lot of these strategies. And so we have started to go down this road of, well, could we just train the parents instead? Where we are starting with it is that Tess Drozdowski is a mentee of mine, and we just got an R34 that is going to focus on emerging adults, and whether their legal system involved or not, emerging adults, and we're going to have a coach who's going to work with their parents. So these are young adults who have a parent. So it's not sort of the really high risk young adults. These are emerging adults who have a parent or a caregiver of some sort who's actively involved in their lives and wants to try to do. We started, folks started reaching out to us when they would hear about CM, wanting to know, like, well, how can I learn that? What can I do with my kid? And it's this like age group where there just really isn't a place for parents to go. And so we're going to try, it's R34, so it's a small study, but we're going to try using a coach virtually to train parents in doing CM. And we've done a few cases, so we've tried it out, but we're going to do a small pilot where we're going to try that out with a coach teaching the parents directly. So it's not the kids, the teenagers that we were talking about, but it's emerging adults. So it's heading in the direction that you're talking about.
Oh, that's probably an even harder population, in my opinion, than teenagers, because they are no longer minors. So, I think that would be a great group to tackle. Now, these are not necessarily people in treatment. So this is just, you've identified through some screening process a high risk group, and then you're beginning to intervene.
Correct. Yep. So folks that are not in treatment. I will say, though, that CM is a beautiful adjunct to any treatment that's going on. So the JPOs oftentimes the kids would also be in treatment, and we would, you know, describe to them how it's can be as an adjunct. I work with mental health therapists who use CM as an adjunct for the cases that have substance use. So it's part of the beauty of CMIC is that it can be an adjunct. And you are right, Geeta, it's a much more difficult population than the younger kids. But as you said, I go after, you know, just go after the punishing research studies.
Well, thank you for doing this.
You like a challenge.
There you go. I like a challenge.
And sometimes you like an extreme challenge. Well, I want to thank you so much for this amazing presentation. I know we've all learned a tremendous amount from you. So thank you so much, and thank you for this terrific audience. Have a wonderful day.